Clearly, Nutrition Diva listeners enjoy their Java because I got an unusual number of emails from listeners in response to my recent episode about drinking coffee on an empty stomach, including many great questions about coffee, cortisol, caffeine, and more. So grab your cup and sidle up for the answers. Hello, and welcome to the Nutrition Diva podcast, a show where we take a closer look at nutrition headlines, research, and trends, and answer your food and nutrition questions. I'm your host, Monica Reinagel, and as I said, I heard from a lot of you in response to my recent episode on whether or not it's okay to drink coffee on an empty stomach. And you all sent in some really good questions, and I wanted to share the answers with all of you. Abby wrote in to say, my colleagues are afraid to drink coffee before breakfast because they've read that caffeine raises cortisol, which will impact blood sugar, and without food, there's nothing to stabilize blood sugar. What would you say to that? Well, Abby, I would say that your colleagues seem to be mashing together a few real phenomena in a way that doesn't really make any sense. So let's see if we can help them and you sort this all out. First, it is true that caffeine can cause an increase in cortisol secretion, but the effect is pretty modest and even more so if you are a regular coffee drinker. However, even if you're not a regular coffee drinker, morning is the time of day that your cortisol levels are already likely to be at their highest. And this is just part of the normal circadian rhythm. Cortisol plays a specific role in maintaining your blood sugar during long periods without food, and that's usually the case overnight. And that's probably why cortisol levels tend to be at their peak in the morning. And it's also why any small bump that you might get from a cup of coffee is not going to have much impact. Now, the relationship between caffeine and blood sugar is a bit more complex. Caffeine does tend to temporarily blunt your insulin sensitivity. So if you were to follow a dose of caffeine with a dose of sugar, your blood sugar might peak a bit higher than if you had that sugar without the caffeine beforehand. Now, this is the kind of thing that can be measured in a lab, but I'm not sure how much relevance it has to everyday life, especially if you don't have diabetes. It is perfectly normal for your blood sugar to go up after meals. As long as it gradually returns to normal, this is not a concern. And in fact, regular coffee drinkers actually have a reduced risk of developing type 2 diabetes over time. Now, that effect is seen with both regular and decaf coffee drinkers, and it is not observed in tea drinkers. So this suggests that the protective effects may not be directly related to the caffeine, but to other compounds in the coffee, but it still may be reassuring to your coworkers. And finally, the argument that without food there's nothing to stabilize blood sugar is the most muddled of all. If you haven't eaten, your blood sugar is already being stabilized or maintained by your various organs and hormones, including cortisol, and not by food. And adding food doesn't really affect your cortisol levels one way or the other, but as the food is digested and absorbed, it will generally raise your blood sugar and insulin levels and not stabilize them. But as I said before, this is totally normal as long as those blood sugar levels return back down to baseline. It's not a concern. So my bottom line for your colleagues, Abby, and for you is that drinking a cup of coffee before breakfast is unlikely to have any meaningful impact on cortisol or blood sugar regulation over the course of the day. Now, here's a question from Lynn on whether coffee irritates the bladder. She writes, I've been told caffeine is a bladder irritant. Are there other foods or drinks that should be avoided by people with an overactive bladder? Now, people with an overactive bladder do frequently report that drinking coffee or other caffeinated beverages worsens their symptoms. And many people assume that this is because caffeine is a diuretic. However, Caffeine's diuretic effects disappear almost entirely when it's consumed regularly. So, this probably has more to do with its effects on smooth muscles and nerves, which contribute to that sensation of urgency. In any case, limiting caffeine to less than 100 milligrams a day, that's going to be one small cup of coffee or maybe a couple of cups of black tea, is good advice for people who have this condition. And there's also good evidence to support limiting or avoiding alcohol and carbonated beverages. Advice to avoid artificial sweeteners, acidic or spicy foods, that's not as well grounded in evidence. If you find that it helps, great. But if it doesn't seem to have any impact on your symptoms, then there really may be no benefit for you to avoiding these foods. And in general, food restrictions can make life more effortful, isolating, and inconvenient. So I'm always on the lookout for opportunities to lift unnecessary embargoes. And here's one last question from Ben. I used to drink percolator coffee, but after living in Italy, I upgraded, and now I drink espresso, made either in a stovetop espresso maker or an espresso machine. So, how does espresso compared to brewed coffee? Well, different brewing methods, whether that's percolator or French press drip, or even whether you make your espresso in a moka pot on the stovetop or in an espresso maker, all of that does impact the final product. Now, obviously, taste is very subjective. What tastes bold to one may taste burned to someone else, and my full-bodied cup may be your cup of sludge. But there are some objective differences as well, and let's start with caffeine. Espresso is much more concentrated. It has about 60 to 80 milligrams of caffeine per 1 ounce shot. And that is roughly 2 or 3 times the caffeine concentration of brewed coffee. But we also tend to drink it in much smaller quantities. Then again, if you're pulling multiple shots, that caffeine may add up pretty quickly. Next, antioxidants. The high temperature and the pressure that are used to make espresso extract more antioxidants per ounce than most other brewing methods. Again, though, we're back to volume. You may get more antioxidants per ounce, but you're probably drinking fewer ounces overall. Among the non-espresso methods, French press tends to extract the most antioxidants because the grounds are immersed in hot water for a longer time. Drip and pour-over methods are a bit lower in antioxidant content, and percolators may actually be the worst of the bunch because repeatedly cycling hot water through the grounds can actually degrade some of those antioxidant compounds. And as you may remember from that previous episode on drinking coffee on an empty stomach, chlorogenic acids and antioxidants tend to travel together, for better or for worse. So French press may be higher in antioxidants, but it will also likely be higher in chlorogenic acid, which may be a concern if your stomach is sensitive, because both chlorogenic acid and caffeine stimulate gastric acid secretion. So if you're looking for the most stomach-friendly brew, that would probably be a darker roast, because roasting reduces chlorogenic acid, made in a drip coffee maker or a pour-over setup. And adding some milk may also help, not because it makes the coffee less acidic, but because the proteins in the milk bind to those chlorogenic acids. And finally, there's also the cholesterol issue. Paper filters trap compounds called diterpenes that can modestly raise your LDL cholesterol levels. For most people, I want to emphasize this really isn't a problem. But if you drink a lot of coffee every day and you are concerned about your cholesterol levels, in that case, you might want to favor paper-filtered drip coffee. French press and percolators let more of those compounds through, and espresso and moka pot coffee fall somewhere in between. I want to thank all of you who write in week after week with your great questions and your comments. I always enjoy hearing from you, and I enjoy answering your questions on the show. So if you have a question you'd like me to answer, you can email it to me at nutrition@quickanddirtytips.com. If you'd like to find out about having me speak at your next live or virtual event, you can learn more at wellnessworkshere.com. Nutrition Diva is a Quick and Dirty Tips podcast. Holly Hutchings is our director of podcasts. Steve Riekeberg is my audio engineer. Morgan Christensen heads up podcast operations and advertising. Rebecca Sebastian is our manager of marketing and publicity. Nat Hoops is our marketing and operations assistant. And I also wanted to say a special welcome to Maram El-Naguib, our new podcast associate. Thanks to all of them, and thanks to you for listening.